introduce myself again and then we'll get going. So my name's Louise Irvine. I'm a GP and I'm co-chair of CANSG, which stands for the Clinical Advisory Network on Sex and Gender. Welcome to our first webinar. This webinar is an introduction to CANSG's work, and we welcome questions, discussion, and ideas for future webinars. The webinar is being recorded and will be put on our website. CANSG is a group of about 100 clinicians from England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, working in many areas of healthcare. We are primarily concerned about the treatment of people with gender dysphoria, especially children and young people. Our aims are to enhance professional and public understanding of sex and gender in relation to healthcare, to improve knowledge about the causes, consequences, and treatments of gender dysphoria, and promote free and respectful discourse on these topics amongst healthcare professionals and with the wider public. Over recent years, CANSG members have been involved in contributing to public consultations, talking to NHS organisations, politicians and policymakers, doing research, creating educational materials, providing information to other professionals and the wider public, and supporting clinicians to raise this issue in their workplace or professional bodies. Many of us are directly providing care for patients with gender dysphoria. We want to ensure that the treatments we provide are grounded in the best available scientific evidence, that they help our patients and don't harm them. Tonight's introductory webinar is focused on some of the challenges of providing care for gender questioning children and young people. We'll hear from Stella O'Malley, psychotherapist and author, who will speak about the research underpinning gender healthcare in children. Then we'll hear from Dr. Bob Withers, a Jungian psychoanalyst, who will talk about some challenges in working psychotherapeutically with gender dysphoric clients. And finally, we'll hear from our membership secretary, Dr. Aileen O'Brien, who is a consultant psychiatrist and academic, who will talk about the reasons clinicians have joined CANSG and some of the difficulties they've had, but also some of their successes raising the issue in their workplaces and professional bodies. Clinicians have struggled to challenge the gender affirmative model of hormones and surgery, which is being promoted by many healthcare providers, institutions, and professional bodies. And it has felt very hard to be swimming against the tide. Now it feels at last that the tide is turning. The CAS review led to the proposed closure of the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service, which is the provider of gender medical services to children in England. Under the proposals for the new children's gender services in England, puberty blockers will no longer be routinely prescribed, but only given under research conditions. Instead, psychological approaches will be the first line of treatment. There's a public consultation on this until the 1st of November, which you can contribute to. And please look at our website tomorrow for CANSG's contribution to that consultation. The turning of the tide has various causes. Research showing a high percentage of the rising numbers of young people referred to gender clinics, especially teenage girls, have multiple complex problems, including indicating that their gender dysphoria is likely to be a result of complex personal, social, and psychological factors, and not an innate problem located in the body. The growing awareness of the lack of evidence of the safety and efficacy of medical interventions, as demonstrated by the systematic reviews in England, Finland, and Sweden, and the rising numbers and voices of detransitioners whose poignant testimonies speak of the human cost of these treatments. But there's still a long way to go. Young people aged 17 to 25 are still being given invasive and irreversible treatments for gender dysphoria. There's a similar lack of evidence for safety and effectiveness of these treatments, and many of the young people have similar complexities and comorbidities such as mental health problems, yet the adult clinics don't offer psychotherapy routinely. There are still no services for detransitioners. Children are still being misled that it's possible to change sex, and private providers, some based overseas, are providing vulnerable young people with puberty blockers and hormones without proper assessment, oversight, or care. CANSG also has wider concerns about the confusion between sex and gender and what it means to be female or male in relation to healthcare delivery, research, language, and data collection. So CanSG still has a lot of work to do, and we hope that some of you will join us in taking up these issues. We see these webinars as the beginning of the necessary discussions that will lead to further changes for the better. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Stella O'Malley, who will talk about the evidence for gender affirmative healthcare for children and young people. Please put any questions for Stella in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And also, if you're on Twitter, we're using the hashtag CanSG Do No Harm, and we'll be posting some links to relevant items in our Twitter feed. So over to you, Stella.
Thank you very much, Louise. It's lovely to see such a large crowd. And it does feel like the tide is turning. It feels like things are changing really quite fast. It's been a long time coming, but it's great to see it arriving all the same. So I'm going to share a screen. And the idea behind us all kind of giving some information around this, some of you will know it very well, some of you won't. And what we're trying to do is just give a nice background. So to remind anybody who doesn't know, trans is an umbrella term. Anybody who identifies as trans is trans. It's not a diagnosis. While gender dysphoria is a diagnosable mental health condition, it is, according to the DSM, which is like the Bible for psychiatrists and psychologists, it's the psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity, or as Ken Zucker said, more simply, a persistent desire to become the opposite sex. I just wanted to point that out before we get into the actual evidence around the different interventions for children that have kind of arrived like a rocket in the last decade or so. And another thing that has arrived like a rocket is, as Louise mentioned earlier, is the change in the cohort. So historically, in the literature, there was two groups that sought to be the opposite sex. Little boys, usually. I was actually one of them, but I was a little girl, but and also middle-aged males. They were the two groups that consistently might have entered into a gender identity clinic prior to maybe 2010 or so. Suddenly there has come a new cohort. You can see the graph there, startling from vanishingly rare in 2009 and 2010. You can see the rates of the girls and the boys, and it's gone up really quite quickly. And the girls astonishingly quickly, as it says there, 4,000 plus increase. Every time we're changing this, stat every time as the years go by, but it's huge increases among females. And again, also huge increases among males. So effectively, a new cohort has arrived in the last 10 years, and it's adolescents. We've got no long-term studies to kind of really base any quality treatment. And so you can't help but think this is experimental. And when we are experimenting, generally the rule of thumb is least invasive first. I like to kind of set this out with, if you want to look at gender dysphoria, if you're working with gender dysphoria, maybe you're a clinician or a psychotherapist or a youth worker or a teacher, I like to kind of distill it into, there's three basic ways how gender dysphoria can be kind of helped with a person, how a person can be helped with gender dysphoria. For starters, the individual can change their sense of gender identity to align with their body, i.e. their mind can end up becoming comfortable with their body. That's one way that gender dysphoria can alleviate. A second way that gender dysphoria can alleviate would be the individual can change their body to align with their mind. So you can change your mind to align with your body, or you can change your body to align with your mind. The second one would mean medical interventions to match what's going on in your mind. The third option, I would argue, everybody can do, and it's also a gift for life. The individual's ability to cope with and manage their distress can be helped with a range of different psychological approaches and actually psychosocial approaches. So being able to handle distress and being able to increase your distress tolerance and being able to develop your coping skills, you can always begin with that. No matter how distressed the person is, that will help them while they decide whether they're going to change their mind to align with their body or change their body to align with their mind. In a way, that's up to the individual. The third option, you can arguably always help. I like to kind of set that out as a reminder to people that there's more than one way to address gender dysphoria, and it's not necessarily medical transition. So the psychosocial interventions that have been happening in childhood in recent years would be these three. Number one, you develop distress tolerance and coping skills. And so that would be an established, well established approach that many people can do. Teachers, youth workers, parents, lots of people can help a child with their distress tolerance and their coping skills. Social transition is a new intervention. It has no evidence base. We do not know the impact of changing people's names and pronouns and their sense of identity and their perception and their self-perception and other people's perception of them. And some people using neo-pronouns, we have no idea. So anybody who's talking confidently about that is arguably a charlatan because we don't have an evidence base. We don't know the impact of social transition because it's new. And people who are psychologically minded would have strong opinions, but they won't have any kind of backup supportive evidence to base upon. And then there's puberty blockers. They were designed originally in 1980 for children with precocious puberty. These are children who arrive into puberty atypically at a young age. It might be 6, 7, and the child would have their puberty stopped or blocked, and then their natural biological puberty would unfold. They'd stop taking the blocker maybe at 9 or 10, and they would have puberty. It was kind of a quirk that was happening to some children, and it has been kind of kind of categorized to help children with gender dysphoria in the 90s, really. I think 89 was the first child, but maybe the 90s in the Netherlands is when they started, and they thought, I wonder if we help children with gender dysphoria by stopping their puberty. And when you stop a puberty, you're stopping a sexual awakening. And when you consider around 70 to 80% of these children have historically been gay, lesbian, or bisexual, you realize stopping a sexual awakening is an extraordinarily strong intervention that I would argue requires a hell of a lot of forethought, and I don't actually think is an ethical way to go forward. So if we look at, I better get back to the evidence rather than my opinions, the evidence base around social transition. So the independent CAS review submitted a report to the NHS about the management of gender identity for children. And it's the largest of its time. At the time, it was the largest in the world. And they noted that the evidence base for the affirmative only model is severely lacking. The CAS review also highlighted social transition and said it's an active intervention and not a neutral act. So if anybody's there thinking there's something benign, it's no big deal about social transition, you've probably maybe misunderstood or underestimated it. The preliminary research by De Vries in 2012 suggests that social transition correlates with people going on to medical transition. Steensma also suggests that social transition correlates with medical transition, especially in boys. So if a boy transitions to a girl, he's more likely to go on to cross-sex hormones if he only does it socially as a child. And then Zucker made a stronger point in 2019. He said it's a psychosocial intervention which might be characterized as iatrogenic, i.e. a medical problem that is caused by the treatment itself. So you could be creating more problems than you're resolving by overseeing a social transition. Going on to puberty blockers, it's a much bigger and stronger intervention, and social transition is a big intervention. 98% of children who are prescribed with puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. And it therefore arguably locks children onto a medicalized treatment pathway. The Dutch protocol is the research that underpins all the use of puberty blockers around the world. And prior to the Dutch protocol, mature adults, 30, 35 years old, were put forward for medical transition. They did not do it to younger children. They didn't do it to young adults. All of the children in this Dutch study, which I'll go into in a little more detail in the next slide, all of them had childhood onset. That means, age 3 or 4, and it persisted all the way through into adolescence. So that is unusual because these days an awful lot of children would just have adolescent onset, which is a different group. The Dutch protocol is based upon 3 stages of gender-affirming care. Puberty blockers around 12 to 14 years old, then cross-sex hormones about 16 or 18, and then on to surgery. And no other study managed to replicate the kind of results that the Dutch had with their study. And this is their study, the famous Dutch protocol. It's based upon a study of 70 children. There was 2 papers written about it, but it's just the same 70 children. It wasn't any more than that. And the 70 children were followed until around about there were 21. 15 of those children dropped out. Some of them got diabetes, and obesity kind of disqualified them. Some of them refused to participate. They refused to continue on with the study. One died because of complications around their genital surgery. The results of the short-term seemed promising. That's taking apart, pulling out the 15 and the one who died, but the emphasis was on gender rather than mental health. So if they said they were happy with their gender rather than happy with their mental health, that was deemed a success. There's been no long-term follow-up. There's planned to be a long-term follow-up, but there is none yet. And I want to point out that the Dutch protocol explicitly discourages social transition. It explicitly says it would impact the rates of persistence, so that they were not approving of it. When you look at the Dutch protocol in a little bit more detail, Michael Biggs, the sociologist from Oxford, he has some brilliant research, and he talks about how, I'll read it out, the finding that gender dysphoria had resolved. So this gender dysphoria that apparently resolved in the Dutch model depended on the Utrecht gender dysphoria scale and the body image scale, which have separate questionnaires for each sex. The researchers switched versions over the course of the study. And a boy who wanted to become a girl, for example, answered the male questionnaire at the beginning, before puberty suppression, and then the female version afterwards. So the boy was asked the equivalent of, you know, do you like getting an erection, or do you like being perceived as a boy? And then as soon as he took puberty blockers, then the questions went to, do you like being perceived as a girl? And arguably, had the child not got any puberty blockers, they could have argued in a very extraordinary way anyway there. So it's a kind of a noted flaw in the Dutch model. And more importantly, Biggs highlights this. The results after surgery exclude 8 patients who refused to participate in the follow-up or who were ineligible for surgery, and 1 patient killed by necrotizing fasciitis during vaginoplasty. The authors did not mention the fact that this death was a consequence of puberty suppression. The patient's penis, prevented from developing normally, was too small for the regular vaginoplasty, and so surgery was attempted with a portion of the intestine which became infected. A direct result. A fatality, when you think of the COVID tests, a fatality rate exceeding 1% would surely halt any other experimental treatment on healthy teenagers. So it's extraordinary that so much comes from the Dutch protocol, considering out of 70 children, 15 were pulled out and 1 died. However, that's where the kind of the birth of puberty blockers came. NICE did 2 systematic reviews in 2020, 1 for puberty blockers and 1 for cross-sex hormones. Both revealed low quality evidence. The review conducted by NICE graded certainty of evidence for puberty blockers as very low in every category, including impact on gender dysphoria, mental health, body image, global functioning, psychosocial functioning, cognitive functioning, bone density, and adverse effects. So it was really, really a shocking study that came out. These systematic reviews on 2 things, puberty blockers and also on cross-sex hormones for children. And arguably, when that came out, really the whole kind of landscape could have been changed. That was in 2020. So the JIDS review was published in 2021, which is astonishing, really, because actually the study was carried out on 44 children between the years of 2011 and 2014. And they decided to carry out this early intervention study. And it was for that reason, because they were carrying out that study, that puberty blockers were allowed to be prescribed. But then the results of the study didn't come until 2021. It could not replicate the Dutch protocol, but they did find initially that those who have severe gender dysphoria and that the puberty blockers had no significant effect on the children's psychological functioning, thoughts of self-harm or body image. And before people jump in with the questions and contradict me, we've got more coming in the next slide. But the point was, this study that was a long-awaited study was coming out, and when they came out, they kind of said nothing to see here. It's blank, as in there's no significant effect one way or the other. But then they also noticed that the children experienced reduced growth in height and also in bone strength by the time they finished the puberty blockers. And Biggs noticed that a significant minority of cases of long-term puberty suppression, the bone mass density is an issue. And as we know, low bone mass density increases risk of osteoporosis and fractures. Then, just recently, it was reported recently that there was a reanalysis of this exact review. So 2 researchers, McPherson and Friedman, decided to reanalyze the data of those 44 children and to find out exactly what was going on when they said there's no changes in psychological functioning. And what they found out was that actually, if you look at the individual trajectories of each of the patients, each of the 44 children, what you found was actually there was huge ups and huge lows, and they called it a mean of nothing. So 34% had massively improved or reliably, 34% had reliably deteriorated, 29% had reliably improved. So 34% got worse, 29% got better, and 37% showed no change. And so there's a real, you can see the, lies and damn statistics in that to say that there's no change is not arguably a good representation of what happened. What happened, we don't know. 34% of them got worse, 29% of them improved. Arguably, there's a lot going on with puberty blockers. We don't know the impact of the placebo. We don't know the impact of psychotherapy, of their lives, whether they had, autism or got treated for any sort of internalized homophobia they might have had. So more studies were taken out, and the CATS review, commissioned by the NHS, was informed by the systematic reviews of evidence by NICE, which I just mentioned, and at the time was the most thorough and wide-ranging analysis of treatments for children with gender distress undertaken anywhere in the world. And the CATS report, first of all, highlighted the huge gaps in the evidence, evidence, and noticed that the affirmative model was severely lacking. They recommended that GIDS should close. I heard Louise mention that a few minutes ago. And according to Dr. Cass in the review, research should be fully embedded in the development of the new services for children and young people expressing gender incongruence. The Cass review noted that, as I said earlier, social transition is an active intervention, not a neutral act. They have commissioned an updated systematic review. And around the same time as the Cass review was published, other systematic reviews were undertaken, such as in Sweden and Finland, and they came to similar conclusions. So now there's been a very noted rollback on puberty blockers. UK, Sweden, Denmark, Finland and France are now restricting the use of puberty blockers to varying degrees, some of them insisting that these interventions cannot be provided ethically and should be only provided in rigorous clinical trials with proper informed consent. We do know a little bit about puberty blockers, very little. We do know it impacts bone mass. It seems to impact cognitive functioning, we're not sure. And it certainly seems to impact penile growth. If the biological boy goes from puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones, his penis doesn't get beyond the prepubescent size. In June 23, just last June, NHS England announced that puberty blockers will only be made available to young people taking part in clinical trials. And there is a submission transgender trend, and CAN-SG and many people have flagged it. There's a great important submission for people to fill out if they're interested. So cross-sex hormones and surgical interventions are a very heavy, irreversible medical burden on the body. They do have a lot of studies backing them up. We do know the information around that. Bone mass, brain functioning, cardiovascular functioning, fertility, sexual and functioning, they're all negatively impacted if you go on to cross-sex hormones or surgical intervention. You can see some great stats and statsforgender.org if you need to look up further. So just to finish, and I'm going to hand over to Bob. I'll probably be shot because I probably ran on. So anyway, 80% of children who attended specialist clinics generally move beyond it. I had gender dysphoria as a kid myself, and I moved on. Social transition is not a neutral act. 70% roughly of children with gender dysphoria become gay, bisexual or lesbian. Internalized homophobia needs to be considered for that reason. And comorbidities, which I didn't get a chance to get into because we can't say everything, is a huge risk factor with people with gender dysphoria. ASD, ADHD, OCD, eating disorders. If you're not thinking of those comorbidities, you've probably missed a significant element of what's challenging the young person. So I think I'm going to stop right there and hand it over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stella. That was fantastic. And I see lots of little clappy hands going up. And just to remind everybody, please keep on posting your questions. I think we'll address all the questions at the end. I've tried to answer one or two simple ones, but at the end, the whole panel will answer. So now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Bob Withers. He's a Jungian psychoanalyst and former senior lecturer in the history and philosophy of medicine. Bob has many years' experience working with researching and writing about gender dysphoria, and he'll talk about some challenges in working psychotherapeutically with gender dysphoric clients. Over to you, Bob.
Hello, thanks very much for the introduction, Louise. I'd just like to say at the outset that you've elevated me to the status of doctor. I am a Jungian analyst and senior lecturer, it's true, but I'm not a doctor. So and thank you ever so much, Stella. That was a brilliant talk. And I'm going to follow it on by saying something about what I consider the challenges of moving people away from a biological medical model of trying to work with their gender dysphoria to try and help them engage with psychological treatments, including psychotherapy. So I'm going to talk mainly about my own experience, which is as an analytic psychotherapist or Jungian analyst. But what I'm saying could equally apply to other psychological approaches, counseling, psychology, clinical psychology, psychiatry, and also the other people who deal with trans people and their psychological, emotional state. So that would include GPs and complementary therapists. And I'm going to try and do a screen share now. Bear with me while I try and get that sorted out. Technologies, oh, there we are. It seems to be working. It's amazing. Stella was talking about what's been happening with children, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the evidence base. I think we should perhaps do another webinar on looking at the research, and I'm just going to say very briefly though that the quality of research that Stella was talking about on children is generally very poor, and the same is true when you look at the research on adults, especially if you look at outcomes for medical treatment. And if you look at statistics for things like the number of detransitioners, that's the people who end up regretting their treatment and wanting to reverse it. There's a lot of quotation in the press and in certain journals, which seems to show that there are very positive outcomes for these treatments, but they're often based on subjective experiences. That's what's called anecdotal evidence. And there's a real lack of proper scientific evidence, which involves systematic studies, comparative studies with other types of treatment, comparisons with placebos, and so on. And people might not think that matters. And of course, lived experience matters, people's subjective experience matters, but the experience of working as a homeopath taught me quite early on that just because somebody feels better because of a treatment doesn't really mean that there's something objective happening that's making the person better to do with the specific effect of the physical treatment. Because when homeopathy was tested against placebos, it turned out, that's a scientific test, it turned out that objectively, scientifically speaking, it didn't outperform placebos. And so a lot of the people that were giving subjective assessments of their treatment, although those were very true, they were attributing their positive experiences to the specific physical effects of the medical treatment, or in that case of the homeopathic treatment. And that's an unreliable form of assessment if that's the only one that you use. So Hilary Cass was talking about children, and she emphasized with them it's very important to work holistically and psychotherapeutically or psychologically if you're working with gender dysphoria before you encourage them to embark on life-changing medical treatment. And that's partly because the evidence is so poor, and particularly the scientific evidence. So going on to think about detransitioners, and I have to admit a sort of an accident of my own work was that the very first patient that I saw, the very first trans patient I saw, was a detransitioner. And that probably skewed my approach to the field from the beginning, although I've become more familiar with different people in different stages of transition since then. But people have to be very brave to speak up and talk about their lived experience of regretting medical transition. And as I say, the first person I ever saw was somebody who spoke about that experience. And he wished that he'd been given psychotherapy first, because he realized after 9 years living as a woman, having fully medically transitioned, that the issues that he associated with his masculinity, and that he thought would be remedied by identifying as a female. Things like the psychotic rages that he exploded into with very little trigger, issues around sexuality, anxiety, feeling suicidal, all of those things didn't get better through the transition. And he wanted to see me to explore the possibility of returning to live as a man, only unfortunately, of course, he lost his genitals by then and he couldn't fully go back. So experiences like this suggest that it is very important to try and work psychologically before doing something like my patient did, which he really very bitterly regretted and which harmed him severely. A more recent experience of working with similarly very brave detransitioners, and it's brave because when people speak out, they get accused of trying to undermine the access of ordinary trans people and gender dysphoric people to the medical treatment that they are clear in their own minds will actually sort out their problems. It may not sort out their problems, but if they're very clear that it will do, and if they've been speaking to people who have benefited from medical treatment, then they will tend to silence people like my patient and the other detransitioners. They speak out against a lot of opposition. I don't want to say being trans is a cult, but it's a little bit like trying to leave a cult and then finding that the people who believe what you no longer believe are going to be very emotionally overwrought and antagonistic to you speaking. So I've been full of admiration for the bravery of the detransitioners that I've come across, although I do have to say that the numbers of detransitioners, although they are unknown, most of the studies that have been done do seem to suggest that they're relatively small, although nothing like as small as those studies would have us believe, because the actual exclusion factors in terms of what constitutes transition means that many people who would get included in detransitioning figures don't get included. So the people that I've talked about here didn't go back to their clinics, which had transitioned in the first place, request cross-sex hormones from that clinic, and ask for, as far as possible, an undoing of their surgical interventions. And lots of the studies on detransition, which rate it as very low, including the largest one by Weepers, have to have all of those preconditions before the person is counted as a detransitioner. So the other common experiences, I think, that seem to happen for those who have spoken up about their lived experience as being detransitioners are these. One of my detransitioners was a biological boy who was brought up in a very homophobic environment, and his trans identification, he now realizes, was a result of internalized homophobia, a lot of bullying at school and in his family of origin, and then hitting upon the idea of transition as being a way to get away from the bullying and then explaining his homosexual feelings, and becoming obsessed with that, because I think, as Stella said, obsessional traits are quite common in people who suffer from gender dysphoria, and that certainly was his case. And he became obsessed with the idea of transitioning. And although, I will stop about that there rather than get lost. And the other thing that can happen, of course, is that the female detransitioner that I saw, and this is quite a common story that you do hear from other detransitioners, she was the subject of a number of sexual assaults, which she reluctantly found herself, well, she felt vulnerable to them. She felt that her femininity, her female body, made her the object of that male sexual aggression. And also, I think she associated her own dependency feelings of vulnerability with her female side. So the part of her that looked to these men for affection, I think, was something that she felt had led her astray and that she wanted to get rid of. And so I think these experiences of girls hitting puberty, becoming the object of the male sexual gaze, and also associating vulnerability and dependency with femininity, sometimes, at least in this case with this detransitioner, was something that she wished she'd looked at before she transitioned, because of course it didn't really resolve any of that. So let me see. Yeah. So there's a number of people, while not overtly expressing regret, they wouldn't advise their former selves to medically transition were they able to go back in time and do so. So that the number of people like that is simply unknown. So we don't really know how many people are genuinely happy with the treatment. And so that all these things seem to me to make it important to try, if we can, to work psychologically, to do what Stella was suggesting we do, which is to live with a kind of diversity, if possible. So we don't necessarily all have to be uniformly the same. Even internally, we might have a sense of our mind or our gender identity which is divergent from our body. And many people report being able to live with that happily without having to either change their mind or their body. And that resilience that Stella was talking about is something which ordinary psychotherapists would actually be quite able to deliver if a person is looking for it. But although there are people who do come to look for psychological exploration, there are significant numbers of people who come to see therapists or other practitioners already having made up their mind that gender-affirming medical treatment is the only effective way of combating their gender dysphoria. And of course, this isn't true, as Stella's evidence shows, and the evidence I referred to briefly, which we can maybe look at another day in another webinar, along perhaps with a webinar on detransition, where we can go into that in more detail. But for instance, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence has rated the evidence supporting medical transition as either poor or very poor. But how, and this is the main question I'm coming to now, how can a therapist work effectively with somebody who's already decided that the root of their gender dysphoria lies in their body, which therefore needs altering medically? You see the problem? The person's identified the body as being something which they feel uncomfortable with. So it just makes sense. Let's alter this body. I'm uncomfortable with it. Yeah, that often goes with other comorbidities, which of course are not going to get better, even if you do alter the body, like autism and anxiety, depression. These things don't seem to actually improve, although the person may not be quite so bothered about their body as some of the people who medically transitioned. But what do we do with these people who identify the problem as being in their body? Well, it's the same problem that faces a GP, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, counsellor, or a complementary therapist working with medically unexplained or psychosomatic symptoms. That's physical symptoms which don't have an underlying medical diagnostic explanation. For psychosomatic symptoms and medically unexplained symptoms, and as well as gender dysphoric symptoms, challenging the belief that it's the body that needs altering too directly. If you challenge that too directly, you're likely to arouse hostility, and that will threaten the therapeutic relationship. On the other hand, if you collude with the belief that the body is the problem, then in the case of gender dysphoria, you may hasten the patient towards a medical transition that they could come to regret. Or a GP in the same kind of way. Somebody comes in with a medically unexplained symptom and they say, well, doctor, I need a test, but you've done some tests, they've come back negative. Well, it still might be a problem with my body, I need some more tests. Well, the GP can keep sending the person out for more and more tests, but that's colluding with the patient's experience that it's the body that's the problem. And with a lot of these people, it's not the body that's the problem, it's hatred of the body that's the problem, or unease with the body that's the problem, as illustrated by my 3 detransitioning cases, where, of course, internalized homophobia, in the case of the first person, autogynephilia, or being in love with the image of himself as a woman, and in the third case, dissatisfaction with the vulnerability of the female body. Those things are not going to get better through medical transition. But different clinical disciplines will have developed different ways of managing these difficulties, and I'm sure we could have a meeting, multidisciplinary approach, where we learned how to handle these cases from one another. As a psychotherapist, I just want to contribute briefly at the end here, something of what I think the psychotherapeutic model may have to contribute. So we've got a history of working sensitively with the dynamics of the therapeutic relationship, especially something called the transference and the countertransference, which I'll come to briefly in a minute, and also with something called the resistance. So I'll stop there for a minute. Resistance was a favorite phrase of Freud's, and he said that as well as a part of us that wants to get well, there's also a part that wants to stay ill or not face what the underlying emotional problem is. And that's called the resistance. And a lot of the art of being a good psychotherapist is how to work with the resistance in a way that you don't tackle it full on, but at the same time, you don't ignore it and just please the patient. You have to know when to confront and when to, well, I want to say affirm. I don't mean affirm in a negative or a complicit or collusive sense, but I do mean affirm in the sense of actually affirming the patient's emotional sense of who they are. One does have to know how to balance affirmation against confrontation. And that's often played out in the therapeutic relationship. The transference and the countertransference is the technical term for looking at that interplay of how the patient feels and how the therapist feels. So one example, for instance, is if you take the patient too directly into a confrontational situation and you confront them perhaps when they're very determined to medically transition with a whole load of statistics and the use of the experience with detransitioners, then you can end up not just creating a resistance in the patient, but what's called a hostility in the transference. So the patient will then end up feeling that the therapist is antagonistic, wanting to destroy them. And the therapist may well feel a countertransference hatred, which is to say, I'm trying to help you, but you're experiencing me as attacking you. And then suddenly the relationship breaks down into a very polarized situation and it fragments and there's a danger of it breaking up. Actually, the danger is worse if the transference and countertransference are unconscious, because then they can't be worked with. And Winnicott is somebody who wrote quite brilliantly, I think, about how to work with hatred in the countertransference. He also wrote very knowledgeably about psychosomatic illness, how to work with that, and also about something which has been called mind-body dissociation, which can be a common feature of gender dysphoria. So that's a situation where you experience your mind of one gender as being dissociated from and at odds with and not at home in the body. The body becomes the home for the dissociated thoughts and experiences which are hated. So it might be the vulnerability of the female patient who identified as male, or it might be the sexual feelings of the autogynephilic male who identified as female, or the bodily arousal of the homosexual man in the homophobic environment. These are the dissociated parts of the psyche which are disowned, split off, projected into the body. And then the fantasy is that you can get rid of them by cutting the parts of the body associated with those feelings off. Clearly, that's not going to work, but there's going to be a lot of resistance to working psychotherapeutically. And I can't say anything more about that at this stage. I think I've said more than enough. Apologies if I've gone over. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. That was fantastic. And now, finally, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Aileen O'Brien, who is our membership secretary. She's a consultant psychiatrist and an academic in London. She's speaking here in a personal capacity. She'll talk about the reasons clinicians have joined CANSG and the kinds of difficulties they've faced, as well as some of their successes. And please do continue to post your questions in the question box at the bottom. Thanks. Over to you, Aileen.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Bob and Stella, for your fascinating talks so far. So I've just got a few slides, not many, but this basically just covers what I'm going to talk about today. As Louise says, I'm a psychiatrist in London, but this is an entirely personal capacity. I'm not doing this in affiliation of either of the places I work. And as the membership secretary for CANSG, I find myself talking to clinicians of all different specialties and backgrounds, and I thought I was going to talk a little bit about how I became interested in this area and about the commonality members expressed to me, to talk a little bit about the challenges regarding having a open and respectful debate about this, and the issues about shutting down of debate and of academic discussion. And then as a psychiatrist, I'm going to talk a little bit about the subgroups in CANSG, including psychiatry. So I'll just stop sharing there for a bit. Sorry. Unshare. You see me back again, I hope? Yeah. So from my personal perspective, I just became really concerned a few years ago now about what was happening primarily with children and adolescents. And obviously I can't go into any detail about cases that worried me. I should say I don't work clinically with children or adolescents, and this was really in other areas of my professional and personal life that I became concerned. I've always been a sort of lefty, Daily Guardian reader, and I think I had originally by osmosis had this idea that trans rights and gay rights were sort of the same thing, and obviously that would be something I'd be support without really thinking about it, wanting to be on the right side of history. But as I thought, but my concerns about what I saw regarding young people made me start really questioning that automatic belief system and reading around the topic. Just I couldn't make it make sense. I couldn't understand how the concept of gender wasn't regressive, and was really concerned about the clear lack of any evidence base. And more I looked into it, more alarmed I became. But one of the really scary things was the feeling, and I think lots of people talk about this emperor's new clothes thing. It's like, is it just me? How do you express concerns about this without being accused of bigotry? And as the membership secretary, I can say this is exactly the pattern of thinking that people from all specialties tell me. Often they start by telling me, I'm not a bigot, and we'll say often how, often like many of us from the left, and we talk, and I'm just going to show you a slide, not all but from left in the chemistry, I must say, by the way. I'm just going to put up a slide, which I hope you can see there, of the people who have joined. And I've had fascinating conversations with psychotherapists, psychologists, we have GPs, psychiatrists, nurses, physicians, paramedics, obstetricians. Some of these I say in plural, and we actually have one of some of them, but surgeons, speech and language therapists, physios, midwives, pediatrician. They all will say the same thing about they thought critically about the issue. Oh yeah, no, I've gone back to me talking. That's all right. Those are my slides, not many slides. They've all thought critically about the issue, and we've got people from all different oh, you never saw my slides. Right, that's different. Let me try and show my slide of people. Can you see that? Well, that's a shame. Okay, don't worry. It's basically, they were only 2 slides, and it's basically what I just said. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah, fine. I won't waste time fiddling around with it. Sorry, it worked in the practice, but there you go. So the people, they thought critically about it. Often people tell me they spent time feeling really unsure and isolated, and often sometimes had real difficulties professionally, personally, and then have this overwhelming sense of relief when they join CAN-SG. Some people have got a background in political activism, women's rights, gay rights, and one of the things I think CAN does is make people feel really supported, and it's really something we all really value, that aspect of it. You know, lots of us, what many people will say when they join is that they feel what's happened to young people, especially as we know often, you know, gay, on the autistic spectrum, have other issues. It's been real scandal. I've got an interest in the history of medicine, and I just find it really depressing watching us repeat the mistakes of the past in this kind of you know, iatrogenic harm without any reflection or critical thinking, and what happened to first do no harm. I must also say, I think I'd always said I was a feminist before, but I'm much more of a feminist now, having become involved in this. So just talking a little bit about the shutting down of debate. The shutting down of academic debate is really, really worrying, and the lack of being able to consider evidence-based. And people in our group, some have tried to do work, which I just find it really difficult to publish. People who try and talk publicly or an open, really just, you know, even just a respectful questioning meeting. The example, the training event at Great Ormond Street that one of our members tried to organise was cancelled, and this is very much against Hilary Cass's recommendations. She says it's clear we should be having a respectful and open debate. She says, I'm going to quote, failure to have an open discussion about these issues impeding the development of clear guidelines about the care of children and young people. And the other quote is, with many other contemporary polarized disagreements, this situation is exacerbated when there is no space to have open, non-judgmental discussions about these differing perspectives. You know, the no debate, it has to stop. So just talk a little bit about psychiatrists as a subgroup. So as we have more people joining, we have some subgroups in CAN-SG, for example, GPs, and we have psychiatrists. And psychiatrists include people who used to work at GIDS and left or whistle blew. We've got a lot of child and adolescent psychiatrists, which I guess makes sense. And we've been trying as a group to challenge the Royal College of Psychiatrists' no debate position they've had. And I think I would say we are beginning to have a helpful dialogue with the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And as Hilary Cass suggests, we are beginning to have a respectful and open discussion. And other groups in CAN are having similarly trying to have constructive dialogues with their respective professional bodies. So this has just been a really broad overview, and sorry for my double failure of kids in my background and my PowerPoint not working, but anyway, I'm hoping that as we have more webinars and newsletters, we'll have more opportunities to engage with CAN. Thank you for listening, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up some questions in the questions and answers that are going to follow. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aileen. That was fantastic. We've got lots of questions. We've got half an hour to go, and I think all the panelists are going to come back on. So it's a matter of trying to work out which questions we've got time to answer and who is going to answer which questions. And the funny thing is, the question and answer bit has now disappeared. Oh, here it is. So I've tried to answer some sort of straightforward ones just directly. So I'm going to go through the ones that are more, I suppose, more substantial, or ones that might be of more general concern. One of the things is that there are many more, the questions show that, first of all, the great level of interest, and have also raised up other issues to do with adults, evidence for adults, effect on the brain, etc., etc. And I think if you put in the chat, which is now going to open, if you'd like to put a suggestion for future webinars that we can have, and we can focus down on some of those more detailed questions there, because we can't really do justice to them. Some of them are quite, very good questions, but quite deep, quite complex, that probably need a whole session to deal with. So first of all, I'm just going to go through the list. There is a question here about somebody has said that their recent clinical experience is that those presenting to mental health services with significant mental health issues see their gender issues as totally separate. I believe that this is rehearsed. And along with clinicians affirming without question, how do we challenge this? How do we challenge people who want to keep their issues completely separate? I'm probably both Bob and Stella could have something to say about that.
I'll very briefly just say, obviously, Hilary Cass challenges that because she says that there's a need for holistic treatment. And I'm sure that's true. And I think that's right for adults and for children. So why wouldn't we go with Hilary Cass? And we can use her to challenge people who want to do otherwise. And
Stella, do you have an answer to that, or are you happy with?
Well, no, I agree with Bob that we have to see the whole person rather than just treat symptom by symptom. I don't think that works.
And as Bob said, Hilary Cass did talk about providing a holistic service, and she warned against what she called diagnostic overshadowing, which is that whatever, whenever a child or young person with complex issues, including mental health issues or other issues, mentions that they anything about gender, suddenly everything focuses on that, and then no attention is paid to all their other issues, which we know from the evidence. Something like 3/4 of the children referred to GIDS at least had multiple complex problems. So we don't, diagnostic overshadowing it doesn't help. We're trying to help our patients, we're trying to help people, and ignoring their major problems isn't helping them, is it?
Anecdotally, CAM services will often just not even hold people, just put them on the wait. They'll just disappear off onto a waiting list.
That's right. And then they don't get any help at all. Yeah, that's right. Somebody said here, my daughter is 20 years old and she started her female to male transition 18 months ago privately with help from Gender Clinic located in Singapore. She only informed us recently and she does not want to discuss it with us. Is there anything we can do to stop her from taking testosterone, as we are really worried about the side effects? And as we know, especially for women, testosterone has permanent side effects, for example, changing of the voice, beard growth, hair growth, which doesn't reverse when you stop the testosterone, and also things like vaginal atrophy and other changes. Stella, how would you advise a parent who was concerned in this way?
Let me just make sure that my microphone is working. I think it's incredibly difficult when the child is 20. I think the impact that a parent has is significantly reduced. I would love if the parent was able to kind of access some sort of good therapy for the child. It's not always the solution, but certainly it can help the person stabilize. I think I would certainly visit them. I would certainly try to connect with them, because often, medical transition or testosterone could be seen as a solution. And I wonder what it is they're seeking a solution for. And I wonder whether the parents could help in on that level, just on the wider sense. But it's incredibly difficult when they're 20. There's plenty of organizations they can contact. If they contact GenSpect or Beyond Trans or GETA, they'll find therapists there.
Thanks, Stella. Now there's a question here: is there a connection between autism sometimes undiagnosed, and gender dysphoria. Well, we do know that about a third of the children and young people referred to GIDS services have autism, and that's something that Hilary Cass raised. And that's a far, far higher than in the general population. But what we don't know is why that is. I mean, one of the shocking things about this, when you start looking at it, is not just the lack of research and the lack of evidence, but also the lack of interest. I mean, this is a huge phenomenon with huge impact on people, young people especially. And here we have a phenomenon where, you know, large numbers of children with autism are being referred into clinics, and many of them are then undergoing irreversible medical interventions. And there's an incredible lack of curiosity and lack of research, which I think is really shocking. And that's partly what, you know, we're campaigning for. Does anybody?
I think people are probably too scared to do research, Louise. A lot of them.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? What?
Well, I suppose the best parallel I can think of is colleagues I know of who did research in chronic fatigue, who you know, I think were getting death threats and had to have security. It's very difficult for people.
Yeah.
I mean, what would you?
I think people are also very attracted to a medical solution to any sort of complex issues, and to think, if I could just get the right treatment, if I just there's something very beguiling about that. It makes you think there's an answer to life. And you know what I mean? Life can be very, very difficult, and I think it can be channeled in that way.
Bob, did you want to say something there?
Yes, I did. This issue of death threats for people with chronic fatigue syndrome, it's a little bit like the threats that therapists get for complaints against them under, for instance, the Memorandum of Understanding, which there was a question about. Thank you for that. And also, if the government did criminalize conversion therapy, it would make therapists very, very cautious, because how could we explore things if we felt that the patient turned against us, they could use the law to prosecute us. So, yeah, I think these are very dangerous developments, the Memorandum of Understanding and the Conversion Therapy Bill. And there's something really frightening for people when the complaints which they experience as belonging to their body are actually transferred into something emotional. And that's part of the problem with autism, is that there's a difficulty symbolizing emotion and a difficulty finding words for emotion. That's alexithymia, and that does create a challenge for therapists and also different practitioners. We have to work in slightly different ways. And the black and white thinking in autism also makes people very ill-disposed to be able to tolerate disagreement. So that was what I wanted to say. I'll try and take my hand down now. Thank
you. And I think there was a question about the Memorandum of Understanding. And I just, do you want to say any more about that? It's pleased with the panel comment on the current Memorandum of Understanding on conversion therapy.
Well, as I said, I think it's inhibiting us, and I think it's a very ill-informed document. And I think that the different professions should, you know, they should disinvest in it, or whatever the right word is, as soon as possible, because it's stopping us from doing our jobs.
I think it's an example of the obfuscation of language that you get in lots of things in this area. So conversion therapy, most people would just think, obviously that's a bad thing. Yeah, it sounds bad, doesn't it? And there are whole areas of the confusion between sex and gender. Lots of people don't really understand what trans and trans women are. I think that the lack of clarity of language in our people in public spaces is very very confusing, and makes it it's one of the reasons it's more difficult to have a proper debate, a respectful debate.
Thank you. Thanks, Aileen. Somebody's asked, will you be covering other medical aspects at a later date? I'd love to hear what it's like for GPs trying to support trans identity young people, as well as those living long-term with the health problems that often result from surgeries and long-term cross-sex hormones. And I think this is a good example of something where we could have a whole webinar just on, you know, we have several GPs in the group, and we could have a whole webinar just on how GPs can approach this. So yes, watch this space. That's something for the future. Somebody's asked, is the lack of efficacy true for all age groups, not just children? Now, as far as I know, the only systematic reviews that have been done, which is the best way of bringing together all the best quality evidence, have all been on people under the age of 18. But there is other research which suggests that there are very poor outcomes. All the benefits claimed from treatments, including surgery, they're not validated. They're not comparative. Got no groups to compare, and they don't follow people up long term. Most people who've been in gender clinics don't have. There's no proper follow up of them. So, does anybody else want to answer that question about what's the evidence for older?
Yeah, right. The evidence is very poor, and I think it's actually an example of unconscious transphobia, that we're expecting people who identify as trans to have treatments which are not safeguarded in the same way as the rest of us expect our treatments to be safeguarded. So I'm going to turn that transphobia argument on its head there and point out that the evidence base is very, very poor. It's anecdotal. It's anecdotal evidence. It's not scientifically valid. I'm sorry. Nobody can argue it is. It isn't.
And could I add to Bob's brilliant point is that it feels very much like a kind of a consumer care model rather than a patient care model, where it seems to be that it's more and more being bought in private practice, and it's something people are buying, as opposed to, whether it's a mastectomy or through a GoFundMe, and that isn't giving sufficient care or consideration to the patient, allowing it to become this consumer care model.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, thank you both. Somebody's asked, I think this is a really basic question, what's the reason for the 4,000% increase among females under 18 being referred to gender clinics? Now, the short answer is we don't know, but what are your thoughts on why this has happened? Stella, do you have thoughts? I'm sure you do.
On which? Sorry, I was just looking down.
Yeah, the 4,000% increase among females.
I have many thoughts. I saw that question. I think it's been a perfect storm, but when you look at the rates of, teenagers with access to high-speed Wi-Fi, social media platforms, the explosion of social media platforms, as well as, let's say, the rise in social justice, the rise in queer theory and gender identity, it's a perfect storm of a lot of different events that have happened. But the social contagion aspect is huge. And when people talk about social contagion, it's like they underestimate the impact of it. But like suicide is very much a kind of a condition that's impacted through contagion. It doesn't mean that the pain is diminished. It means that people can be susceptible to a certain condition when it's kind of put into the water, as such, put into the air. And there's something about social media that seems to make it travel that bit faster. And when we look at what happened among adolescent girls during COVID online, we can see we have to be very, very careful about their social media use, especially if they're engaging in kind of long, extended periods online. I think that's a huge aspect for the girls. But just to add one more thing, you'll regret having asked me. When you look at it, like, there's a kind of arguably a golden thread of similarity of teenage girls fleeing from womanhood since the arrival of the hypersexualized teenage girl in the 1960s or 50s. And she wasn't hypersexualized, she was hypersexualized by society. But when you think of then the response is arguably anorexia, and from anorexia they moved to bulimia. We're going into the 80s and 90s, and then from the 90s and noughties into self-harm, and then into gender dysphoria. You can actually see a golden thread with all of those conditions among female adolescents. And it seems to be very much, it begins there like the canary in the coal mine and then spreads out to other cohorts.
Yeah, thank you, Bob.
I don't feel qualified to talk about this as a man, but I have got a slightly psychoanalytic theory about it, which I found in one or two of my cases, though not necessarily all. And it's to do with in psychoanalysis, there's a thing called a defense against mourning, using identification as a defense against mourning. And for some of my patients, I found that the young girls in question have been brought up by quite an open, hearted family system where the mum has sometimes gone out to work and the father's been the primary caregiver. And then in some of the cases I've seen, when the family breaks up, if the parents divorce, the father often goes away, starts another family, and the mother keeps custody of the children. And I think for some of the people I've seen, there's a failure to mourn the primary attachment figure, who's the father, who's the one who's gone in this case. So I think sometimes there can be an identification with that missing figure as a defense against the difficulty which happens in the family from mourning that person. But I hope that doesn't sound too esoteric. It's just something I have found in some cases. The changing cultural pattern where sometimes it's the man who does the primary care, but it's still the woman who gets the main custody, and it's still the man who goes off and starts the new family. But Aileen's probably got something to say about.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, Aileen, do you have anything to say? No?
I was just looking at the questions some comments in the chat about cultural issues, challenges of being a woman in.
Oh, I read something today. Well, I was reading something. I think it was one of the contributors here who wrote something about the influence of pornography, especially on young boys, and not just that, but they're taking that into the classroom. They're using it as a way of sort of teasing, abusing, oppressing, harassing girls, and it's pretty horrible.
Yeah.
And I think if I was a young girl now at this time, I would probably want to be non-binary.
I'm sure. I'm absolutely
get
sure
that.
I would.
I don't necessarily think all these girls want to be boys, but I think they just shut down that I don't want to present as female because that just makes me an object.
Yeah.
And so I really get that, and I think we have to show a lot of empathy with that.
Yeah,
with
and I mean, I think someone's put a question in about culture-bound syndromes, and I don't know the answer to this, but I mean, again, it does feel slightly anecdotal, but I think being a teenage girl, has always been pretty rubbish, I think, and seems to be even more rubbish, and there always does seem to be, everyone was bulimic when I was a teenager, and there always seems to be something. I don't know. I don't know. All I know is that the response from society was very different to that.
I think that's right, what people were saying about girls and sexuality and pornography. But I also think that's difficult for boys as well, particularly the sensitive ones, because there's so much talk about toxic masculinity that it does make some of the boys hate their physical male bodies. And then one way of escaping that can be through the gender dysphoria route, and then the identification as a girl. So I think it's affecting both sexes.
Yeah.
Really.
Thank you. These are really good points. I'm just aware of time. We've got about another 10 minutes. I've got some really great questions that we have to address. One is somebody has asked about the high percentage of looked after children in care who are referred to gender clinics. I can't remember the exact stats, but they are phenomenal compared with the percentage in the general population. And I wonder why do we think that is?
Well, I think it is a case of when you don't have an identity, I can see why you would seek an identity, and you would seek a strong one. So I've always thought that looked after children are going to be that little bit more sensitive to seeking a kind of a strong path ahead, because it's not laid out in the way it would be for somebody with a family that's quite settled, and you know where your mother is and you know where your father is. When everything is very vague, you can say, that's what I'm doing. So I think that's one reason. Another reason I think could be, and this is only my own hunch, but I have met a lot of people who work on that, and they're very often female, not only, but very often females in their 20s and 30s, who are frankly very into the cultural zeitgeist right now. And I do think that would make an impact in the residential homes for children of that age.
Yes.
If you don't mind me coming in with another psychoanalytic point, I think that it's mind-body dissociation that I was talking about earlier, It does happen a lot when there are early attachment traumas or deficits. And of course, looked after children are by definition likely to have suffered early attachment traumas. So I think there's probably quite a fundamental dissociation between the mind and the body set up already, which maybe is a fertile ground for the kind of cultural appropriation of the discourse around gender dysphoria.
Thank you.
That's
Thank,
a really
thank you
good
for that point. That leads into the series of questions are all kind of related, which, you know, because you were talking about how it's maybe young social workers, but and other professional groups. So somebody has written, how do we confidently address these issues when our respective governing bodies are participating in the spread of misinformation and creating a climate of fear with its members? For example, the Nursing and Midwifery Council prompts nurses and midwives to answer trans diversity questions as part of the revalidation process. And the GMC is allowing their doctors to self-ID on their register. Somebody else has written, what do we think are the reasons for the capture of supposedly educated people? And why are so many healthcare professionals, somebody else has used this word, captured and immune to evidence-based?
Can I have a bash at starting with that question? But maybe just start by being I'm going to try and be positive here and say that I'm not sure we could have done this webinar a few years ago. And I do think things are getting a little bit better. I think the way we can do, I mean, it's weird watching it, isn't it? If you are in the emperor's new clothes category. And I think, but all we can do is try to have organisations like CAN, SG, and all the others, but you stand up and people have to. There's power in numbers, and people have to be. It's important to be respectful and open. We have a law behind us. Some very brave people have gone and proven that what being critical of this ideology is legally protected, and we just have to be, sensitive to these are a group of people who are need help, and we want to. And we want to help them, and we want to not do harm, and we want to have a respectful and open debate. And I think things are definitely going in the right direction.
Thanks very much. Let me just look. Is there any evidence or studies showing that people can be deterred from medical transitioning if they address any comorbidities first and or make a substantial investment in their psychological health, i.e. can you offset detransitioning early? I think in answering this, it's really important that we make it clear that, you know, as health professionals and as therapists, it's not our aim to sort of actively change people. It's our aim to help people to explore and address their issues. And if in that process, through that process, they come to terms with or come to accept their sexed body and no longer want to go down a medical pathway, that can happen, but it wouldn't be what we would be setting out to do. And I think Bob is dead keen to come in on that.
Yeah, no, there's two things. I agree with you totally, Louise. We don't have a specific aim in view, although it's very hard to sit alongside someone with comorbidities who is intent on medically transitioning. That's very hard as a therapist. I just wanted to say very briefly that about the figures of detransition, because there was another question about that I just wanted to say. Some people were saying I was underestimating the numbers. I'm sorry if I gave that impression. I know there's a Reddit site with loads and loads of detransitioners on it and their supporters, but I think nobody knows the number of detransitioners. So that's one thing. But about this question of can we actually help people by addressing their comorbidities, one of our members, Az Hakim, had a group at the Portman Centre where he had some people who were looking forward to medical transition, but they wanted a psychotherapy group. Another group of people also suffering gender dysphoria, coming back the other way. They'd had their medical transition, but they still had gender dysphoria. He mixed the two groups together, And over the 11 years that he worked with those groups, only 2 of the people who were looking forward to medical transition decided to go through with their medical transition once they'd met the people coming back the other way, because they saw what sorts of problems they had, what sorts of bodily problems were going on. And that wasn't an aim of ours. He wasn't sitting there trying to stop people transitioning. It was just a side effect of people actually getting proper information rather than stuff off the internet or from mates or from people who had already transitioned and had an emotional investment in advocating it to other people, let alone the people who are sponsored by the drug companies to sell treatments. So that's just one observation.
Thanks very much. And before I take the next question, I'd just like to ask if people have any suggestions for future webinars, please put them in the chat now, and we'll keep a record of the chat. And that means that we, you know, there's been a huge interest and there's obviously a huge need for this sort of discussion and debate. So we want to be able to meet that need in future. This has just been a very much an introductory webinar about our work. Somebody's asked, said that Aileen mentioned a seminar at Great Ormond Street Hospital that was cancelled. Could you tell us a bit more about that? So this was a whole day conference, actually, that was organised. Went quite far down the line of being organised. It was organised for psychiatry trainees. Aileen might know more about it, but and it was trying to have a balanced mixture of speakers on all the different aspects of this gender debate. And because there were 1 or 2 speakers that some psychiatry, I think, trainees objected to, they made a complaint. And as a result, it was decided to shut down the conference and not let it happen. So I don't know, Aileen, if you know any, but it's a good example of the kind of suppression of genuine professional.
Yeah, I think it was right at the end, wasn't it? And I think my memory is Helen Joyce was going to be, it was the day before, Juliet, who organised it, just messaged, it was cancelled the day before after lots of work. Juliet could probably put in the chat exactly what happened, but it was meant to be to all the child and adolescents trainees. And I think the idea had been, my understanding, it was a panel of people from different views, and got pulled because of people feeling unsafe. Just hearing the debate. I
think we're kind of, I think it's 24 minutes past. I'm just quickly sort of looking through. I mean, it's very frustrating because there are lots of really fantastic
brilliant questions.
And we can't really deal with them all.
We could do one every evening this week.
Yeah, I can see that. Somebody's made quite an interesting point here. Is anorexia nervosa a useful parallel as to whether gender dysphoria resides in the body or the mind? Anorexia sufferers are certain that they are too fat when they are in fact dangerously thin and literally wasting away. And of course, I would add to that, we don't help those people suffering from anorexia by saying, yes, you are too fat and we're going to help you lose even more weight, do we? But I mean, do we think that's a useful parallel to try to understand why some people might locate their distress in their body and think that's where
I think, I mean, the other parallel is body dysmorphic disorder, isn't it? I think that there are overlaps between all of these where you've got a disconnect between your mind and your body, and I might defer to Bob and Sarah a bit more about this. But and I mean, I get it. It was covered at the beginning, and there's some questions about it. But one of the real challenges is this suggestion that it's not, we're not people. If we're not allowed to use, lots of people would say it's bigoted to use those as comparisons of body dysmorphic disorder or an eating disorder because of this kind of stick of rock model. And that's one of the challenges, I think, I'm sorry if that makes sense to people, about the language. Stella, you probably can explain that a lot.
Yeah, I think it's very key to reject that, because I think it stigmatizes people with mental health. I think it's not fair for people to say that people with gender dysphoria somehow, they're rejecting the kind of description of having a mental health issue. And I'm like, that's stigmatizing people with mental health issues in turn. And so I don't think that's actually very decent of people. I think
it's trying to use a parallel with being gay, though, isn't it? So that's where the confusion comes from.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a good. I think anorexia is a better likeness to the distress involved of gender dysphoria, the rigid thinking, the determination that it's within you, that you just have to be it. Like, you speak to anybody who's in the depth of anorexia and they'll say, I'm fundamentally, I am that person. There is nobody else I am. So that it does feel that there can be huge similarities. While when I look at somebody who's gay and I talk to somebody with gender dysphoria, I just think, well, no, I don't see the huge similarities. I just don't see the likenesses.
Thanks very much. I think sadly we're coming to the end, and I'm just looking at all these amazing questions and wishing we could answer them all. So we're taking notes of your questions, we're taking notes of the suggestions you've made, and we're going to come up with a program of webinars. If you want to know when the webinars are, you can obviously look at our Twitter feed, but you can join. We've got a newsletter that's going to be coming out, and if you want to be on our newsletter list, just email us, please.
I'm impressed someone's doing it, watching from Sydney. It must be the middle of, what time is it in Sydney?
I think somebody's also watching from India, as far as I know. Contact.canesg@gmail.com.
6:30 p.m. Okay.
Write to us. We'll put you on our newsletter list so that we can then notify you of future webinars. Look at our website. It's got very good FAQs that actually answer quite a lot of the questions that people have posed here in more detail. And is there anything else I should be telling people about at this point? I'm going to just check. Do any of our panelists want to say one last word? And I'm just going to check if there's anything else.
I'm just loving all the hearts.
Yeah. Make sure to check Canesg. It's a great website, and follow us on Twitter. And if you can use the hashtag Canesg do no harm, it would be great. Or first do no harm.
Yeah, but the hashtag actually is Canesg do no harm. But I think you're absolutely right. We perhaps should have said first do no harm, but do no harm. We don't want to harm. We want to help, and we don't want to harm. And there's an awful lot of research that still needs to be done. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to promote that proper evidence-based to help our patients.
And I just say thanks to everybody for coming along and for some fantastic questions.
Thanks to Ali for being our admin.
Yeah, thanks to Ali.
Yeah, I don't think we could have done this without her. Yeah, we've got 154 participants, and it's just been great. And you've been so engaged and so stimulating. So thank you very much, and thanks to all our panelists as well. Good night.
Good night, and thank you.
Thank you.